So the plan for today is to run through checklist items and how to utilize checklist items as you're streamlining the different requirements that you might have for volunteers, or perhaps keeping track of where a volunteer is processed in terms of onboarding. Now, there's a lot of different ways within Service to track items regarding volunteers and kind of where they stand. There's ways for you to record attributes about volunteers or let them give information about themselves as well. What makes checklist items unique, or kind of allows these to stand out from other features like tags or custom fields or groups, is that checklist items carry with them dates associated with them. So if we care not only to know whether or not someone is approved to do some kind of task, or they have completed some item, or they have permission to register for certain things, but also when did that happen? When did they meet that requirement? Or when did this training get completed? Or when did this certification happen? Or perhaps even also, when will it expire? That's what checklist items are very good at, because we're not just tracking whether or not something has happened. We are tracking when was that completed, when is a due date, perhaps, if we want to assign it, and also potentially when will it expire. So anything where you want to track not just whether or not something has been done by a volunteer, but sort of when that happened, that's what checklist items excel at. Now, there's a lot of different things that you might track using checklist items. If we click into this under Attribute Management, from here we can see a couple examples in my demonstration console, but there are a lot of different things that kind of meet the parameters of what these are good for. You can see some examples that I have here. An annual safety training, whether or not someone is approved to be a driver, whether or not someone has completed a new volunteer orientation, have they completed a TB test, have they turned in their intake form. So these can be used for sort of physicalized things like volunteers completing certifications or turning in documents. They can be used just to track where someone's at in process. Have I overviewed their profile? Have I approved them for something? Did they attend an orientation or attend a training or complete some kind of training cycle? So you can use these to track kind of where a volunteer is at in process, especially if you have any sort of onboarding that you take volunteers through as they're creating profiles, and you want to track, where are they at and what have they completed and what have they yet to do. Now, these don't necessarily have to be something your entire volunteer base is engaging with. And of course, a lot of these examples would kind of fit into that category. If you have drivers that you're working with, it's probably not every single volunteer. Or if volunteers need to complete some kind of certification, it's probably for a specific set of events. So these checklist items don't need to be globally applied, which can also make them very useful. Now let's talk about creating a checklist item. It's relatively straightforward. We do that at the top of this page. So just to kind of be pedantic, we start out from the main dashboard, go under Attribute Management into Checklist Item Inventory Management. This is where we create and maintain or perhaps modify existing checklist items. Maybe we want to change the description or the name or attach an award to it. But up at the top of this page is where we create a new item. From here, we can give it a title. So perhaps we have some kind of certification that I'm tracking. We give it a name. We can give it a description. Maybe this points to, where this is completed or how the volunteer does this. Your volunteers may see this information depending on the type that you identify for this checklist item. We can make checklist items either private or public. If a checklist item is public, then that means volunteers can see it on their profile, but they can't necessarily make changes to it. Volunteers don't have permission to modify their status on checklist items. They can just kind of see where they land. If you make a checklist item private, volunteers don't see this at all. It's not information that's a part of their profile, but of course you can track it on the back end, use it for restrictions, searches, reports, all that kind of stuff. Now, if what we're creating is something that every volunteer needs to do, think something like a new volunteer orientation, or perhaps you want to keep track of, has the volunteer completed their interview? If there's some kind of process or onboarding that you have that every volunteer needs to go through, then we might want to set this auto-assign to yes. What that means is when a volunteer creates a new profile, this checklist item is set as assigned, and it's due within whatever time frame you select for the due date. So if this is something that every volunteer needs to do, and I want to kind of keep tabs on this and maybe check in with them if it's been 2 weeks since they made a new profile and this is not yet done, then we might set a due date of 14 days, and again, auto-assign to yes. If this is something that I'm just periodically engaging because it's specific to certain scenarios, or I only need specific volunteers to fill this out or do this thing, then I would not automatically assign that. And that's probably going to be the case for the vast majority of checklist items that you create. Again, unless it's a part of an onboarding process that every single volunteer needs to engage. So if you don't automatically assign a checklist item, the due date might not really come into play because we might just be marking that, oh, this person did complete this thing. And so I don't really care about the due date per se. I'm more tracking in that case, when did they complete it? And perhaps when will it expire? The linked award is the last thing here. If you would like to, you can attach an award to a checklist item. And if you do that, then when you mark the checklist item as completed, then it will automatically give that volunteer that award. Now we have a webinar running through awards that we recently ran through, and if you want to learn more about those, feel free to engage that. It's on our YouTube channel. But just briefly, this is like a badge that your volunteers can receive. It's kind of like a visual indicator on their end of something having been completed. Now, I mentioned before that you can make checklist items visible to volunteers if you make them public. So let me just show you what that looks like real quick if I add this checklist item in. Now, I want to point out, I have several checklist items here. One of them is private. Most of them are public. But the profile that we're going to look at isn't going to see all of these because they're not all necessarily assigned to that volunteer. Now, one thing we can do in Service that you should be aware of, and if you're not, this would be a helpful tool, is we can just use our admin profile to switch over to the volunteer perspective. So if we use the profile icon here up at the top right, we can then go down and say View as Volunteer Access Level. If we click on that, it takes us to the volunteer perspective, and we can see in here View Volunteer Checklists. So this is using my own account. If we click into View Volunteer Checklists, we can see kind of where we stand. So in this case, again, I don't see all the checklist items in the system. I only see the ones that have been assigned to me that I either have completed, which we can see on the left-hand side with this icon, or are perhaps overdue or upcoming due, depending on when that due date is, and obviously in relation to today. So again, volunteers can see this information if it's relevant to them and you've made it public. But it's not something that volunteers can click on or interact with. They can't make changes in here. Okay, heading back over to the admin side here, we are going to take a look at managing checklist items in volunteer accounts, and then kind of the fruit of engaging with checklist items. What does this actually provide in terms of running searches, running reports, setting restrictions, and kind of general use cases there. So to manage a checklist item is actually done through the volunteer part of the database. We don't do that through the checklist item inventory. This is where we create them. So if we go into the volunteer database, we can run a search. We can look for a specific set of people using an advanced search, or maybe we want to just see the whole database, leave that blank. Maybe we're looking for one particular person because this person just completed the certification. You might search for that person by name. When you're looking at the list of volunteers, if you have checklist items in your system, you will see this item directly to manage checklist items. So we can just click on that immediately. If you have not yet created any checklist items, you won't see this icon here. So you're not going to clutter up your screen with things that you're not using. You can also always see this option if we click into manage someone's profile. It's kind of like the main menu for a volunteer. And if we scroll down a bit, we can see that same icon, view or update volunteer checklists. Now, when we click into this, we can see all of the statuses and all of the checklist items, even those that have not yet been assigned to this person. So we can kind of keep tabs in here. Let's say that, again, this person just completed that certification checklist item we created. We can use this drop down here to say it was completed. We can also assign things if we want to have like a due date, maybe mark it as due or overdue, things like that. But let's just say we're completing this in this case. And then we have a bunch of other fields. We have the due date, which in this case, kind of irrelevant. We're just marking when it was completed. So maybe they did this certification on Monday. I can select that here, and that'll be the date completed. If we leave this blank, it will default to today's date. You can add an expiration date. So let's say this certificate is good for 3 years. I can go in here and pick 3 years down the road, select that as the expiration date, and then once that date comes to pass, the system will automatically flip this from completed to expired. And then on the far right-hand side, there's a place for you to keep notes as well. Maybe I attached the certificate to their profile. I could make a note about that in here, and then I could attach the document to the volunteer account. These notes are primarily for you. You can keep tabs of different information about this checklist item in here. And then there's reports and searches you can use to engage that data. All right, if we go ahead and update this checklist item, so we can do like bulk updates too. We don't need to do that right now. In this case, we're just doing a big update. But if we go ahead and click on Update Volunteer Checklist, that'll apply any changes that we had made. So you can see it kind of auto-filled like the due date, which again, irrelevant because we have a date completed in this case. And then also our expiration date is sort of the next relevant date here. So again, you can manage this information in an individual volunteer account, and you can manage multiple checklist items at once in that case, right? If I had selected multiple items here to be completed, when I click on Update, all of those items will apply, all of those changes will apply. And again, you can also do bulk updates. I kind of alluded to this earlier. Let's say we want to say all of these checklist items need to be reset. I could select all these checklist items, and then I could say change all of the statuses to assigned, do a bulk update in here, and modify all of them at one time. All right, so there are ways for you to modify multiple things at one time using these checklist items as well. Okay, and again, this is just directly within one person's profile. We can also engage with checklist items on a larger scale if we need to. So let's take an example in my case. I have a checklist item that's called New Volunteer Orientation. And in my system, I have an event that represents that orientation. So when volunteers attend this event, this one's in the future, but let's just pretend this has already happened. What I can do is go and look at the list of attendees. So I can go into view the registered volunteers, select these people. Of course, first I would mark no shows if none of these people or certain people didn't show up. I'd do that first. But I can select all the people who did attend, and I can go down here and click on Manage Selected Volunteers. That will basically run a search for those individuals. There are other ways to run this search through like the advanced volunteer search, but this is a pretty easy way to do that, especially in this kind of context. Now I can take those results in the drop-down menu up at the top, the bulk actions here. I can say, let's update these volunteer profiles, and we're going to bulk update checklist items. Now there's a lot of things we can do bulk updates on. In this case, we're specifically talking about checklist items. I happen to know where this is kind of in the page if you're having trouble finding things, because there are a lot of options on this page. You can use Control F or find in browser and then just search by a term, and that'll highlight it for you. Now down at the bottom, we click on Select Items to Bulk Update, and then we tell the system what checklist item we want to modify. So in this case, this is that New Volunteer Orientation, and I want to mark it as completed. And let's say the orientation was completed today. I can mark that as the date completed, and this one doesn't have an expiration. This is kind of a one and done sort of thing for my volunteers. If we go ahead and click on Update Volunteer Information, that will apply or kind of give us like a confirmation screen where we can then apply those changes. And then from there, we've updated all of those accounts at once. So again, this isn't something you have to do on an individual basis, and especially if you're using checklist items to track, did this person attend this training or this orientation? And you're actually tracking those as events in Service, and you can then go and pull the list of attendees. This is a really easy way to kind of run that process. And now from here, the point of doing that kind of checklist item is that, I use this as a restriction. If volunteers haven't completed my orientation, then they can't necessarily sign up for all my events. So for example, my sort and repack event here, if we go in and update this event, there's a section called Registration Restriction Options. And if we expand that, in here you can see what restrictions are applied. Now for this event, I just use that checklist item that we have here for new volunteer orientation. So this is selected. The way restrictions work in Service, you select who is permitted to register, not who's prevented from registering. So if I want volunteers who have completed this new volunteer orientation, that is exactly what I select here. If they also need to have done other things, maybe they need to have done this annual safety training, then I would select that as well. And I might also say I want to require all of those checklist items, not any. Any is the default here. That means that if one of those two things has been completed, the volunteer is okay to register for this event. If I choose all, that means both of those things have to have been done in this case because I have two things selected. Now, one thing I've also done for this event, if we scroll down a little bit, there's a section that says Registration Restriction Failure Message. And this is what pops up when someone tries to register for an event, but they don't meet the requirements. There is a default message. You can see this says optional. The default message is pretty generic. It basically just tells the volunteer, thanks for trying to register. You don't meet the requirements. Contact an admin for more information. And that's generic on purpose. There's a lot of times where you might set restrictions that you do not want volunteers to be necessarily made aware of in terms of you didn't pass your background check. You don't really want Service to tell someone that kind of coldly. So that's why that message is generic by default. But if we're setting a restriction like this, I actually want my volunteer to know what to do instead. So what I've done is I've changed this failure message to say, hey, thanks for your interest. In order to register, you need to sign up for the new volunteer orientation. And that's actually listed kind of below this message when a volunteer fails. They'll see the failure message, and then below that, they'll see all the other events. And so that orientation will be listed there. And I might even make this bold, I think, if I were doing this in production. This is just a way for you to kind of direct volunteers to what they're supposed to do, as opposed to just saying thanks, but no thanks. Okay, so we can obviously use these checklist items to create restrictions and control who has access to sign up for certain events. There's one other aspect to this that I want to point out in terms of controlling access to your events. And that would be you can tell the system to limit visibility using a restriction. This isn't something that I would necessarily use all of the time because it modifies the normal registration process for an event. If you do limit visibility for an event using a restriction, that means that the event is not going to be publicly posted. So even if you have this set to publish online, which you still would want to do, you would still want this set to yes open, the event will not display on your event listing page. A volunteer would have to log in first, and then the system knows who they are, they know what requirements they meet, and it would be able to tell, it would be able to show correctly to the certain individuals who can register for this, right? So let me show you what I mean by that. So we'll take a look at this in my demo console here. Let's actually go to the event listing page real quick. So if we're talking about the normal registration process for this event, I do not have it hidden, so we can see that sort and repack event. And if I click in to learn more about it, and then I decide I want to register for this event, just click on sign up, and then I'll just log into my profile, right? If I was a new volunteer, it would have the account check page. I might wind up creating a new profile, but let's log into this existing account. So then a volunteer from here, in my case, right, I don't have that orientation completed. So it says, thanks for your interest, but you need to sign up for the new orientation first. And we can see directly below, because I've pinned that orientation to the top, that's the kind of the first thing volunteers see, right? So they can then go and click on that, sign up for that. Once they attend the orientation, I'll mark it off, and that'll give them permission, right? But that's kind of the normal workflow for your events. Let's jump back over to this example, and I'm going to limit visibility now. So we'll go ahead and update this event and go into restrictions. And I'm going to say that I want to limit visibility based on this restriction. So if we go ahead and update this now, and let's go back to the event listing page. Now that event is not publicly posted. Volunteers cannot see this event until they log into their account and they meet the requirements. Now, if you recall, I just tried to register. I don't meet the requirements for that event. So when I log in and go to sign up for an event, I'm still not going to see that event, right? So it's kind of changed the process for volunteers. They have to log in first. Sometimes that's a very good thing, right? Your event might have sensitive information that we do not want volunteers to see unless they already meet the requirements. Or maybe you just don't want volunteers to see everything that's going on. You only want them to see, the events that they meet the requirements for. And you kind of want your volunteers to start from that logged in perspective. So there's kind of different ways to approach this. Again, it's not something that I would necessarily do for all of your events. But it does have, its particular use case. Okay, so that's that limited visibility. Now, again, this is one really strong use case for checklist items, right? We can set restrictions on our events so we can keep tabs of where someone is at, have they completed the steps to be allowed to register for this event, and then just use that as a way to control who has access to your events. So this is a very important aspect of checklist items. One other kind of component with that is then just keeping tabs on things. Where are people at? Do I need to try to move people through this process? Who has done this thing? Who hasn't done this thing, right? And that's kind of getting into the world of running searches. So under volunteer management, if you go into the advanced volunteer search, there is a section in here for checklist options. So we can go in and say, well, I'd like to see all of my volunteers who are due or overdue on their orientation, right? So they have not yet completed the orientation. Maybe I just want to email those people and invite them to attend an upcoming orientation. So you can run a search like that. You can create saved searches too off the back of that kind of checklist option, especially if that's something that you're running on a regular basis. And again, this gets into how do we onboard new volunteers, but you might like to just run a search once a week to see who are all the new volunteers that have not yet done an orientation and maybe email those people. We can also run that search in conjunction with other things, right? Maybe I want to search for volunteers who have not yet completed their orientation. And I also want to exclude people that are registered for an orientation, right? So we can say they have exactly 0 registrations because in my system, if they have a registration, it has to be the orientation. That's like the first thing that they can do. Or maybe I have a filter based on a tag. So there's different ways to do this, but you can create a search that then identifies volunteers who, need to attend an orientation. And then I can just take that list and go and send them an email. So of course you can run searches based on checklist items. One other thing kind of in conjunction with that I want to point out is you might have like a series of checklist items that apply. Like they have to do the orientation. And then once they've done the orientation, then we have to do an interview. And once they've done the interview, then we have to do a placement, right? So you might be keeping track of multiple different stages or steps using checklist items. So you might want to create a scenario where, okay, I want to see volunteers that have completed the orientation. Yes. So let's search for those people. But then I also want to say, okay, but of those people who have done the orientation, I want to find the ones that have not yet done the safety training. So we can go back into the advanced search. And down at the bottom, there's an option that says advanced options. Combine the results of this pending search with the results of the previous search. Basically, you're saying to the system, okay, take my last results. I want to search within those. So again, in our case, it was all the people who have completed the orientation. So, okay, of those people, let's go back up to checklist items. We can say how many of those people have not yet done the orientation. So it's due or it's overdue, right? So we can search by this, and then it would basically take that list of people who have done the new volunteer orientation. Here are the ones who have yet to do the safety training. And again, I could save a search like this, especially if this is something that I'm frequently running. I could go and say, here are all the volunteers that, need safety training. So I could create a saved search like that if I didn't have a typo in there. But then we can use this basically all the time to just run that combined search, select those results, go and send them an email. Maybe I have a prefab email that I've saved. And there's different ways that you can kind of set up that system. But that way we can quickly find the volunteers that are in process, but not right where I want them to be yet. All right, there's one last component that I want to mention about checklist items, and that would be a way to report on checklist items specifically. In the report management section under volunteer management, there is a report specifically for checklist items, and it's number 9 here, this checklist status report. It's a spreadsheet. It does not use the date range at the top of the page. You can use a query, so I could run a search for a certain set of individuals, like what we just did. I could say, only show me those results, and then we can choose a detail level here. I'll talk about this in a minute. But then we can also select to include whichever checklist items we'd like to in this report, and whichever volunteer information we'd like. So maybe I want like their name and their age in there. So we can select as much data or as little data as we'd like to include. Let's just do a couple of these checklist items to not have all of them here. So if we select a couple checklist items and we click on Run Report, this will give us a spreadsheet. Now I did high detail in this case. Let me pull this across here so you can see this. So this checklist report is giving us, of course, the volunteer's name. We also get their age because I selected to include that. And then we have the 2 checklist items that I selected. So we have the annual safety training, and then we have this new volunteer orientation. All right, so as we're looking at this, because I did high detail, we see kind of all of the information from the checklist item. We see the notes column, the expiration date, the date completed, the due date, and the item status. If we had run this in medium detail, it would clip off these last 2 columns, and it would just have the status, due date, and date completed. If we ran this in low detail, it would just have the status for each of these checklist items. So that's kind of what those different detail levels do. But if you need to compare or kind of quickly look through lots of different checklist items for lots of different people, maybe in conjunction with information about the volunteer, then this report is a good tool for that, right? You can obviously print out a large scale spreadsheet that has all of that information kind of in one place. Okay, so there's a lot of information here regarding checklist items in terms of how these are set up and kind of different use cases for those. I want to run through some questions that have come in, so please feel free to continue writing in questions as you have those. So we'll start off with this. When you set a date for expiration, does it automatically send an email to you and the volunteer that they need to recertify once it expires? It's a really good question. Generally speaking, your checklist items do not notify either the volunteer or staff based on any of those status changes. You can use searches to indicate kind of like where someone's at or what is upcoming or what's going on with those things, and then use that to notify your volunteers if you would like to. But it is not automatically notifying volunteers or staff based on any of those kinds of status changes, whether it's the due date, an expiration date, anything like that. But what you can do is what we were kind of looking at under the advanced volunteer search. We can go into checklist options, and from here we can search for, a checklist item and its status, whether it's due, completed, overdue, or expired. And then you can also choose to search by date ranges if you would like to, like did this expire between certain dates? You can also say, was this completed between certain dates, which can sometimes be like a finer tooth search. Like I could say, show me people who did this certification, 3 years ago next month. So like it's going to expire next month, that kind of idea. And in fact, there's actually a quick search for that sort of concept right below. You can find volunteers whose checklist item, again, we could say like this certification, and the completion date is over X number of months, right? Like this was done 30 months ago, so I know it's going to be expiring in the next 6 months. So this can be like a quick search to ping those people and say, hey, this certification needs to be re-upped in the next 6 months or it's going to expire, right? So again, there's no notifications that are automatically sent out based on these statuses changing or the dates within the checklist items. They're all there to drive searches that you might run, which then, of course, you can choose whether or not to send notifications or send emails or texts off the back of that. Okay, very good question. Another question came in, if a checklist is public, so this is going back to creating a checklist item. If a checklist is public, can the volunteer mark that as completed on their own? So the answer to that is no. The checklist item type is where we'll find private versus public when we're creating these. We can see that in this example down here, all these ones as well. If a checklist item is public, that does not mean that volunteers can make changes to this on their own. Instead, what it means is that a volunteer can see this on their profile. If a checklist item is private, a volunteer can never see this on their profile. If a checklist item is public, a volunteer can see it on their profile if it has been assigned to them, or it's been marked as completed, or due, or overdue, or expired, any of those things. So they would be able to see it if it's relevant to them and it's public. But like we looked at earlier, so we can switch back over to the volunteer perspective. If we go into view checklists, a volunteer can see their statuses in here, but they cannot click on these. They can't make changes to it. It's just a way for them to kind of keep tabs on where they're at. Now, one other thing kind of related to this, you might have like this example of certifications, right? I might ask a volunteer, to upload this cert once it's been completed. You can allow volunteers to upload documents to their profile. So this upload file attachments section. If you do not see this in your system, this is a setting. I'll show you where in a moment. It's in the system configuration. But this would allow volunteers to upload their own attachments or their own documents. So maybe they have a PDF of a certificate that they got from completing, some kind of learning module. Once they do that, they could upload it to their profile. And you can actually be notified of that. You can receive an email notification every time someone uploads an attachment, or you can search for volunteers who have file attachments or had a file attachment uploaded between certain dates, right? Maybe I just want to say like who uploaded an attachment in the last 10 days. I could go and run a search for that. And then I could use this to go and double check like, okay, was this the cert that they were supposed to upload? If the volunteer uploaded it themselves, there'd be a little warning icon here, but then you can go and you can download that attachment, verify it, and then go and mark that checklist item. So sometimes this can be used as a part of that kind of notification process. So where that setting is in the system configuration under system management. And if we go into security and privacy settings, there's an option in here that says allow file attachment uploads. And we can say yes, admin only, or no. So obviously, if you don't see that section, yours is set to no. Admin only means that when a volunteer uploads the file attachment, it is only then visible to administrators. Leadership team, group leaders would not be able to see those attachments. If you would like to be notified, you can put in a person here, and then that person would get an email every time a file attachment is uploaded saying so-and-so uploaded a file attachment. And then, of course, you can go and log in and double check that. Okay. Well, those were the questions that we had come through. Obviously, if you do have more questions related to this subject, please go ahead and keep writing those in. We'll leave this open for a minute. But what we covered today is kind of the different use cases and different ways to utilize checklist items in service to kind of keep tabs on your onboarding process or where volunteers are at, what they have permission to do, and then how to run searches off the back of all that kind of data. Of course, as you have more questions, if there's anything else that we can do for you, I want to point out you can always click on this Need Help button. You can type in questions or topics through here. So we talked about file attachments. You could search by that term, see articles that have to do with that. There's a lot of good information in here, but you can also always click on Contact Us and submit a ticket to our customer support team through here. And then, of course, I want to also mention if you go to that video.servicetech.com, there's also a short link that was sent in the chat. I think this v.service. That will take you to our YouTube channel. And of course, from here, you can see all of the previously posted recordings from webinars, and lots of different training material. The vast majority of this is intended for you as staff, but there are some resources here for your volunteers as well. So I want to thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next webinar next month.